word mistake implies, accident, negligence, not bad, willful intent. There's a big difference between people who made mistakes versus people who have committed intentional, corrupt, willful bad conduct. Those aren't mistakes. It may have been the case, as we sometimes see, that somebody initially at a company or somewhere else cooks the books a little bit because they had a bad quarter, or lies or fibs a little bit because they want to get to the next milestone. And I guess you could call that a mistake, but then if you persist in it, it's no longer a mistake. It's actually just a course of bad conduct and nefarious conduct that's going to get you in trouble with the law and sometimes with criminal authorities.
What is probably the most egregious thing you've seen slip in to mistake territory into criminal intent? The
biggest mistake I've seen made, and it happens incrementally over time, not just on one day and overnight, is a sort of avoidance of creating a good principled culture, whether it's at a hedge fund or a financial institution or a tech company, bad cultures that begin to permeate the place. So for example, at Theranos, if you allow people to have the view that the most important thing, in fact, the exclusively important thing, is to make money or to have edge in the hedge fund context, then you're going to create a culture in which you're going to be attracting people who are not just going to be making mistakes. The mistake is the bad culture. But you're going to be attracting people who think it's in their interests and in the company's and the firm's interest to break the law to increase the bottom line.
Well, you mentioned Theranos, for example. How complicit are other actors, like investors, who perhaps let bad behavior happen in the first place?
Yeah, so complicit is a strong word that has legal meaning, and investors were victims. But people make categories of mistakes that cause them to become victims, and one of the things that I think is not talked about enough is this thing called FOMO, fear of missing out. Now, in the Theranos case, if you followed it to any degree at all, you know that Elizabeth Holmes and other people were enabled and propped up by investors, by a board of directors who wanted to believe in this too good to believe, too good to be true story. There were red flags, right? A critical mistake that people make is they see red flags and they overlook them. The idea of missing out on an opportunity is sometimes a mistake that people make that blinds them to problems.
Is there something systemic or inherently true about the financial industry or investor behavior that lends itself to these slippery slopes?
I don't know if it's endemic to or exclusive to the financial community. I mean, I think it's human nature. People want a shortcut to wealth and to prosperity if they can find it. And the marriage of somebody who's selling something, who's very charismatic and persuasive and charming and credentialed, by the way, that's like another indicia, not always true, but supposed indicia of truthfulness and honesty. You combine that with, I'm not even talking about greed, but a general interest in wanting to get to the promised land or the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. That's a dangerous combination, and that's where people sometimes surrender their common sense and their good judgment.
What do you tell students now that you're teaching in terms of, entering the financial industry, dealing with investors, and catching red flags as they go along?
So when I was a US attorney, I would speak almost every year to the entire class at Harvard Business School and other business schools as well. And I would say to them, this is a distinction between mistake and willful bad conduct. I would say, look, I'm here not to address my words to the statistically likely 3 or 4 of you who will one day commit serious securities fraud, although I know who you are. I say, more importantly, I'm addressing myself to the vast majority of you, the hundreds of others of you who want to do the right thing, who have principles, who have morals. Because here's what happens again and again and again. Like every scandal, virtually everyone, including Theranos, including Bernie Madoff, including FTX, there were individuals who were not part of the crime, but were in a position to raise a red flag or blow the whistle and put an end to it. And I say to them, there's going to come a time, a few years from now, you'll be at a financial institution or a trading firm or some other place, company or institution, and something is going to feel not right. And your first instinct will be, maybe I should say something, maybe I should elevate it, I should escalate it to some superiors. The next thing that'll enter your mind is, well, what do I know? I don't want to make a false allegation. I don't want to get this other person in trouble, and I don't want to get in trouble. And have people think I'm a troublemaker, and then you suppress that impulse that you had. And that's one of the worst things you can do, is to suppress that impulse. There are always going to be bad people who want to game the system and rip people off and lie and cheat and steal. But if the good people around them are vigilant and clear-eyed and open-minded and are willing to hear reports of bad conduct and elevate suspicions of bad conduct, we'd be a lot better off.
your law firm that you work with now had actually represented a key witness here in the FTX case, Caroline Ellison. When you think about not just FTX, but some of the biggest financial crimes being prosecuted in the country today, it involves crypto. Is there something inherently bad you think about crypto?
No, there's nothing inherently wrong with crypto. There's nothing inherently wrong with any particular kind of currency, and not necessarily any kind of financial transaction. It depends on what you do with it. You know, cash is cash, and cash is almost as pure a method of trade and purchasing as you can have, but cash is also used for nefarious purposes, and sometimes people prefer cash over wire and other transactions to be able to hide the trail so people can't connect the dots. So nothing inherently wrong with cash, nothing inherently wrong with cryptocurrency. Now, I need to be careful about how I speak about some of these cases because my firm has had involvement, but I'll say as a general matter, I don't know that it's necessarily true that the criminal cases involving, and the civil cases involving FTX say anything in particular about the inherent problems or lack of problems with cryptocurrency. Lying, cheating, and stealing has been around since the beginning of human interaction. So I don't know that it says anything about the nature of cryptocurrency or the blockchain or anything else.
What about the people involved? By and large, a lot of these crypto firms, and a number of them are facing investigations currently today, even beyond FTX, in their treatment of customers. They involve a lot younger of a generation.
I like young people.
Is there something, are there mistakes that younger people are making as they enter this new financial universe?
You know, these kinds of mistakes and this kind of, willful misconduct is not exclusive to young people. We prosecuted a lot of people who were very sophisticated and advanced in years. Bernie Madoff was not a young man when he embarked on his fraud and when he concluded his fraud. I will say that there's something probably observable about startups that become overnight very, very, very successful. And what happens in that transition from being small and low value to being gigantic and very, very high value with lots and lots of money being raised is people get sloppy, and sometimes that sloppiness turns into actual criminality.
What happens after your mistakes?
I'm a big believer in second chances. One of the organizations that I care deeply about is one that is involved with the courts to give people a second chance to rise up. I believe that people who have been convicted of crimes after they've paid their debt and served their time should be able to register to vote again. That's not the case in many jurisdictions. And so it depends on what you do. You know, lots of people have served time. Sometimes they get pardoned. Sometimes they make efforts to help other people who have been incarcerated and held accountable. So, I don't think that if you made mistakes and also cross the line into intentional, willful, corrupt misconduct, that forever means you can't do good.
But why was it so important for you to go after insider trading? And where was the relative importance of going after the banks, where many of the executives never faced any jail time?
Yeah, so we went after everything we could. I don't think anybody would suggest that my office, when I was there or even now, was anything less than very aggressive. In fact, most of the criticism we got was for being overly aggressive. We still get that criticism today. You can only make cases that you can make, where there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt that you can provide to a unanimous jury who decides in favor of guilt. No one area was more important than any other area, although probably the financial crisis and potential cases arising out of the financial crisis were at the top of the agenda because of how much damage had been done. Those cases were not brought because people couldn't make the case. In fact, forget about the criminal standard. I'm not aware of any civil enforcement agency that has a lower burden of proof and an easier time of bringing a case against a principal of a financial institution either. And I understand the frustration about that, and I remain frustrated about that. But you have to have a readily provable crime.
What would be, in your opinion, your biggest mistake throughout your career? Is it a case you've lost or something you wish you could have done differently?
So it's the latter. It's something I could have done differently. I've been thinking about this a lot. So I'm back in private practice at WilmerHale for the last year and a half. And I like to think I have an open mind. And, you can persist in a policy without even realizing that it's not a great policy. And I'll give you the example. And I've spoken publicly about it. I wrote an op-ed, published an op-ed in the New York Times about it just a few weeks ago. And this is something that's not as well known to folks. But I think it's a problem. And that is, as a general matter, when we open an investigation with respect to somebody, there's a policy of not telling you when we close the case. So lots of people are in limbo and paralysis because they know that the government is looking at them, law enforcement investigators are examining them, and then quietly the case goes away, but they're never informed. They're not given notice. And so they can't make decisions about their life, their job, their property, their marriages, their social relationships, where they want to live. And I now see that in a more direct way because I represent companies and individuals who are under scrutiny and are being investigated. And for the life of me, I can't figure out why there's not a better policy in favor of letting targets know when they're no longer targets.
Now, I want to switch gears here for a little bit here, because you were very famously fired by the former President Trump's administration. When you think about what's happening in the United States today, the former president is running for president once again, and he's facing multiple trials here. And when you think about the U.S. government and its own cases being made against former President Trump, do you think that the government's own lawyers are making any big mistakes?
I do think that with respect to the January 6th case pending in the D.C. District Court, whose trial is still at this moment set for March of this year, that the Department of Justice went too slow. That I think in good conscience and in good faith and understandably didn't want to appear political when they came into office by immediately having a meeting to target the former President of the United States over January 6th. They were very understandably and legitimately focusing on the individuals who stormed the Capitol, who engaged in the rioting, who engaged in violence. So I think a little bit they didn't focus on the potential criminal culpability of Donald Trump and the people around him for instigating an insurrection. And then when the January 6th committee in the Congress started doing its work a year or two later and had very explosive testimony from a lot of people, most notably Cassidy Hutchinson, it's my sense, and some of the reporting bears this out, that's when the Department of Justice got into gear and said, wow, we maybe need to very forcefully and aggressively look at the conduct of the former president himself. But they lost like a year in that delay. And so some of these issues about whether or not these trials are actually going to be able to be started and finished and resolved before the election, a little bit falls, and I hate to say it, but a little bit falls at the feet of the Justice Department that, for understandable reasons, delayed investigating in a focused way the former President of the United States. And now we're in a race against time. We have a clock ticking. The issue is, and the reason that the clock is important, is should Donald Trump win and become the president again, and if these trials have not happened, he has the ability to make them go away.
Well, what do you think also of the former president's own legal defenses?
So, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, it's very serious. So Donald Trump does have, and he has lots and lots of cases, 4 criminal cases, he had civil cases, he had arguments over executive privilege in other contexts as well. He does, on occasion, have very, very good lawyers. One of his lawyers on a couple of his cases is a former colleague of mine who used to work for me, Todd Blanche, former prosecutor from Southern District of New York. But he also has lawyers who are convicted criminals. So it runs the gamut. He's not served well, but part of the problem is he doesn't serve his lawyers well, right? It is very difficult, as I understand it, to represent Donald Trump if your advice is not listened to and you're being asked to take outrageous and radical positions, as they sometimes are. I think this whole argument that he has absolute immunity just because once upon a time he was president of the United States is a somewhat radical argument. So it runs the gamut. Some of his lawyers are effective and good and have some ability to control him, and others are hopelessly in over their heads. Now,
before I let you go, a commentary on kind of the state of financial prosecution overall. It's interesting, if you look at the kind of macro data that exists out there, you see fewer cases, but bigger fish being sought after. Do you think that's a good strategy, or that it enables smaller petty crime to get away? Does it encourage, in some ways, financial crime?
You know, I don't know. I guess if it was if the opposite was true, you would ask the question the opposite way. You would say, hey, the numbers are up, there are more prosecutions, but there's smaller fish. Is that a good strategy? Because it's letting the big fish get away. I tried to follow I don't know if it's a strategy, but just an approach of any significant case, whether it was $1 million case or a $10 billion case, and we did both, was worthy of prosecution, because for the victims of those different crimes, those different cases, for them it's their whole life savings potentially. So it was a big deal to actual human beings, their lives and their livelihoods. Sometimes it's not a matter of strategy, sometimes it's a matter of what comes forward. You have cooperating witnesses, or you have people who are whistleblowers who come clean about various things that they've seen. And that's the reason why you get this ebbing and flowing of bigger cases versus smaller cases. So I don't know that there's a lot of conclusion to draw from it. But in one sense, probably going after bigger and bigger frauds and holding people accountable and getting victims their money back is a good thing.
You mentioned a few times you're on the defense side now. Is there something these days you find yourself saying more to clients to advise them?
My favorite statement I like to make about mistakes is I like to learn from other people's mistakes, right? And I think good companies do this, but when you see an enforcement action, whether by the SEC or the DOJ or anyone else, against some other company that's arguably in your space, even if you don't have that problem, you should maybe convene a meeting of the board and others and make sure that you're not going to be in the same position as that other company. Really study other people's mistakes and have discussions about them. And obviously, most importantly, Sonali, hire very capable counsel.